My name is Kayla Sheehan. I am the marketing manager at SEA, and I am here with Alexandra Good. Alex is a PhD candidate with the Coral Reef and Ocean Health Lab studying under Dr. Keisha Barr. Her dissertation investigates local global human impacts on coastal ecosystems, while simultaneously creating a high school science curriculum aimed to empower and engage underrepresented students in STEM fields. She's originally from our neck of the woods, Cape Cod, and received a BS in marine science and a master's in marine studies from the University of Delaware. Tonight, she's going to be presenting to you on the future of Fiji's reefs, blending Indigenous knowledge and science for sustainable conservation. Alex, take it away.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much to SEA for having me. This talk is something that I'm really passionate about for a lot of different reasons. Well, one, it was an amazing SEA program that we ran last summer. And two, I have a lot of close personal ties to Fiji and the coral reefs there. And I have a passion for incorporating Indigenous knowledge into Western science to really conserve coastal ecosystems. So just a little bit more about me. Okay, the slide changed. Perfect. I just wanted to say bula, which in Fijian is hello. I'm going to use some Fijian words throughout the presentation, and I encourage you to use them as well in the chat or ask your questions. Um, I am a PhD candidate at the Heart Research Institute. Please excuse me if I mess up my words or I stutter at all this evening. I'm actually defending my dissertation in 3 weeks. So I will be Dr. Good in 3 weeks. So my brain cells have all been wired, uh, overwired these days. But I was a reef technician on S317 last summer, which was the Coral Reef Conservation Program in Fiji. The photos that you're seeing right now are actually not from the S317 program. One of the reasons I was brought on to the program last summer was because I had a lot of experience already studying coral reefs in Fiji. My master's research at the University of Delaware was all conducted in Fiji. I looked at 3D printed structures as artificial reefs. So it was a reef restoration project where I printed 3D printed corals and I outplanted them onto the reef in Fiji. And I measured with some living corals and I measured things like coral growth and fish um, feeding behaviors and fish abundances on the corals and things like that. So I spent a lot of time in Fiji from 2017 up till COVID in 2020. I spent a lot of time in the local villages with the children. I spent a lot of time underwater, scuba diving and being on the reefs. So I have a lot of experience with the Fijian reefs, and I was really excited to bring that to the SEA program. Okay, so just a little roadmap for our presentation today. I'm going to first start by talking to you about the coral reefs in Fiji and what is known as the FLMMA network, which I'll get into that more, what that is. Then I'm going to tell you some stories about our time in the village, or different villages. We actually visited a lot of villages while we were there, which was amazing. And then I'm going to tell you some stories about the coral reefs that we visited. Then I'm going to share some of our research findings with you. And then finally, I have some concluding thoughts to leave you with. Okay, so Fiji. Fiji has over 300 islands. It's an archipelago seen in the map here. While it has over 300 islands, we were not able to see all 300 of them last summer, but we did see quite a large area of Fiji using the beautiful boat, the Robert C. Seamans that you see pictured here, the SEA ship. So the places that are highlighted in yellow are actually where we were on the first half of the Fiji program was on shore. So it was a shore component for 2 weeks. And then we got on the Robert C. Seamans for 2 weeks and sailed around. So the locations covered in the blue squares are places that we travel to on the ship. Um, Fiji's really unique and special because it is one of the most biodiverse reefs in the South Pacific. South Pacific. It's made of over the coral reefs in Fiji are over 10,000 square kilometers. So it's one of the most extensive reef systems, largest reef systems in all of the South Pacific, which is crazy because it is so tiny on the map, but it has some of the most important and biodiverse and abundant coral reefs. And these coral reefs you'll see are important for a lot of reasons. They provide coastal protection. They provide ecotourism, which is huge for the country of Fiji. Actually, their tourism is really what funds a lot of their economy. So these coral reefs are bringing people from all over the world to come see them. And I definitely recommend if you ever get the opportunity to see them. Specifically for Fijians, they and all over the world, but coral reefs provide food and livelihoods for over 500 million people around the world. In Fiji, this is especially important. They rely on what's called subsistence fishing, meaning that they primarily fish to feed their families and it's not for commercial sale. So they are going out, and you can see the picture on the right is a picture that we took while we were on the ship, looking into the village, and you can see the two men or women out there with the net trying to catch the fish, and those are the fish that they're going to have for dinner that night. So this was actually the morning of we were going to be going onto shore to meet with the village and have what we call a sebu sebu ceremony, and I'll talk more about that. But we looked in shore and we saw them fishing for our dinner that night. They provided us dinner that night. They're the most generous people. And so, like I said, the subsistence fishing means that they are out there fishing every day to feed their families. So they have a deep connection to these coral reefs, and it goes back hundreds of years in their family history, and it's directly impacting the health of these coral reefs is directly impacting their well-being, which is very different than how the coral reefs are looked at in the United States. As you might know, unfortunately, coral reefs around the world are declining at an alarming rate. Since 1980, we've lost over 50%, over half of our coral reefs due to a combination of local and global stressors. So, looking at the combination and the interaction of these stressors is something that I'm really passionate about, that I'm doing for my PhD, and something that we considered for the research on this program. So these are some maps of Fiji specifically, and it's going to show you on the left, there's some local threats like overfishing and watershed pollution from runoff of agriculture on shore. And you can see that right around the coastline, there is high local threats from where there's high populations of people. The Fiji Islands that are farther away from the larger populations have a much lower threat to those local stressors. However, you can be far away from humans and you're not going to be able to outrun those global threats like cyclones and heat stress. So, no matter how far away you are from the hotels and the agriculture farms, you're unfortunately these days, no coral reefs are really safe from global climate change. However, because there are these local stressors, we can't think globally. Globally, we want to conserve all of the coral reefs, but we can act locally. So I call this place-based conservation, which means that we're focusing on conservation issues that are specific to that place or region. And this is going to be really important later in the talk when I show you the different sites that we studied, and you can really see how these different reefs respond in the different areas. So Fiji does a great job at this. The culture of conservation in Fiji is what they call these FLMMAs, which is a Fiji locally managed marine area network. And it was started as a way to promote the local villages taking control of their own conservation of their reefs. And so it was to put the power of conservation back into the local people and back into the communities rather than at a national level, rather than the Fiji government saying, okay, you can't fish in these areas, you can't fish in these areas. They were noticing in Fiji that that wasn't the most effective way to manage the reefs, because while the government can sit in Suva and say you can't fish there, people were still going out and fishing there. It's very hard at a federal level, especially in a developing country like Fiji, to federally manage the reefs across all 300 islands. So the community starts their own MMA. They manage it, they own it, and they control it. So it's giving the community control over their marine resources. And as I'll show you an example of where this really worked, because the community then sees the data that us scientists are collecting and how it's helping to shut down and have these MMAs. And then they're even more, uh, they have an even more initiative to protect them. So while global climate change is a huge issue, and I'm not going to undermine that whatsoever, local actions can make a huge difference. And really what this program is all about, and the students on S317 learned all about this from an amazing ecologist, Helen Sykes, but it's all about empowering the communities to manage their own reefs. So now in Fijian, this works within their vanua. So a vanua is their traditional land owning unit. So you can see on this map the different vanuas, 1, 2, 3, and 4, outlined here. So you have your village is maybe here, but your vanua, spans this area to this area on the island. This is the island of Taveuni. So then this is another vanua, number 4. So that's a different village or group of villages that own that vanua, and so on and so forth. So within that vanua, you control the fishing rights in that area. And the fishing area or the fishing capabilities in that vanua is called a goalie. And so what they will do is, or what the scientists are promoting the villages to do, is to shut down these goalies to have them be protected from overfishing. So when the villages do, or if the villages do decide to close their vanua or goalie to fishing, it becomes a taboo. So a taboo is the Fijian word for a marine protected area. So it's that LMMA. So it's that locally managed protected area called a taboo. So this means that you cannot take anything from that water area for a set period of time. Traditionally, they have sometimes in traditional Fijian culture, they do have times where they shut down the goalies and create a taboo. For example, when one of the chiefs dies, there's 100 nights after the death of a chief where there is no fishing on their vanua. This is to pay respect to the chief, and it's to ensure that they have enough food in 100 days, that there's enough fish out there for them to collect and have a big feast for everybody to join in and celebrate and the life of the chief. So the members of the vanua make these decisions about these taboos. No Fijian government legislation is needed. Um, this works well when you can have traditional authority in an area, but obviously legally is weak. So if somebody comes into this area and does decide to fish, legally there's no repercussions for this person. It would have to be local and traditional authority, however they manage illegal activities or authority in their village. So that is something that me and the students did see was an issue in some vanuas, but others have very effective ways of creating authority and managing these areas. So one of the Fijian sayings, and I'm not going to say the whole saying, but it is everlasting fish for our future generation. So like I said, this is a long-term vision that the Fijian people have about coral reef conservation. They know how important their corals are to their livelihoods, because they're out on the coral reefs every single day, fishing and snorkeling and even collecting things like invertebrates to eat. It's not just fish. And because of this connection that they have to the coral reefs and to the ocean, they have a strong sense of environmental stewardship and really, really care about healthy ecosystems leading to healthy people. Um, they want to have a sustainable life. They want to uphold their heritage. So it's culturally and physically very important for them that these coral reefs are healthy. And like I said, this is something that we don't really get to see in America. People don't have this connection to the ocean and to the earth like the Fijian people do. So it was very interesting to compare how coral reef conservation is done in a developed country like the US and how it's done in a smaller developing country like Fiji. So we got to witness firsthand by visiting the villages really how important it was to the people to protect them. And with the students, me and Dr. Barr, the chief scientist, really emphasized the power of knowledge transfer. So we were giving them knowledge about their coral reefs based on the Western science that we were doing. And then we would go into the village and we would learn from them. We would listen and learn from them about what's important about their coral reefs. Why do they want to protect them? What have they been doing? What have they seen or not seen? And this knowledge transfer was really powerful for the program. One of the students reflected. I asked the students on the program if they had anything that they wanted to say for the presentation tonight. And one of the students, Colton Super, he said, "When I reflect on my experience in Fiji, particularly our village visit, I recall the locals' eagerness to learn about how they could support their reefs. They are experts, having a deep understanding of the importance of coral for sustaining large fish populations, which are a crucial part of their food source. The historical knowledge they shared about fish populations can be instrumental in building a comprehensive narrative of the reef's history in devising effective strategies to restore their fish populations. I firmly believe that there is a crucial gap between the science community and the local community. And if we can bridge this gap and lead to the preservation of our reefs while simultaneously providing sustainable solutions for long-term benefits." So Colton here beautifully captured the essence of this local managed conservation and how the historical knowledge that the villagers shared with us um, was really important for the students as they continued on in their research. Okay, so the first thing that we had to teach the students when we got to Fiji was about the Fijian culture. They were going to be going into these villages and interacting with these people, and they were going to be going into their homes and onto their land. And we wanted to make sure, of course, that they were very respectful house guests and they knew all of the correct cultural ways to act. So the most important cultural experience that we wanted to introduce them to was the Sevu Sevu ceremony. This is a ceremony that is done in Fijian culture for really all different types of life events. So, for example, it can be some sort of ritual. It can be just a social gathering where friends want to get together and share some kava, or it can be a community meeting. But it basically is a cultural and spiritual gathering where everybody there that's sitting in the circle is accepting one another. So, why this is important is wherever we went to study the coral reefs in Fiji, we went ashore to the local village and asked permission to use their reef or their vanua. We asked permission to snorkel and do research on their vanua. And how we did this is we presented them with a bundle of kava. So the top picture that you see there is what kava looks like in its root form. And what they will do with it is they will grind it up and they basically mix it, sieve it into some water into those bowls that you see in the bottom picture, and they will pass it around and drink it. So it's just a culturally very important drink, the kava. So we showed up at every reef, every village that we went to with a half-kilo bundle of kava. Um, you really should never show up without it. That would be extremely rude in the Fijian culture. And then we would participate in the ceremony of them accepting the kava and them giving us permission to use their reef. So For this, everyone was dressed appropriately in a sulu, and you will see in the pictures coming up that the sulu ties around their waist and it covers the knees all the way down to the ankles. It's sort of like a wrap. They're very beautiful, very fun to wear. But especially everybody should have their knees covered for the ceremony. And women are also expected to cover their shoulders in Fijian culture. And there should be no hats, sunglasses, anything on the head. That's actually very threatening to the Fijian people, to any headwear. You'll be told where to sit. Men sit cross-legged, but women sit with their knees facing out and their feet back. And we all sit in a circle, and they accept the kava in their cultural tradition. So that's a really great ceremony that the students were able to take part of and really experience the culture. So another great part of this is that really before we started collecting our data, the students did a 2-night stay in a village. So they lived overnight in a village with a Fijian family, and they were able to have these invaluable experiences and perspectives on the culture and the daily life. And I think for them, when I talked to the students, it really made their research more meaningful because of how much these people respected their land and their oceans. So these are just some videos that I have of that we took. The first video is of the school that we went and visited, and the local school actually did a whole performance for us, a cultural performance, but they asked us not to share the videos of the cultural performance of the kids in the school. So I unfortunately can't show you the performance, but I wanted to show you what the school looks like there. And then the second video is after the village visit, at the end of the village visit, we all got together to have some food and dance and sing. The Fijians love to dance. They love to sing. They are the most kindest, fun, generous culture I have ever been a part of. So I just wanted to share these with you. So you can see that they don't have much, but they have everything that they need, and they are very, very happy and welcoming. They loved to have us visit. So you can see here some of the students and some of the kids started a little dance line. So while we were there to do science, we also had a lot of fun in the village. Another one of my students, Caitlin Krauth, said, after our surveys today, we visited the village to thank them for allowing us to learn about their reef. So much singing, dancing, and laughing, and a beautiful rainbow. I was told rainbows usually bring good weather, but today it was a sign that the village had good angels visiting. If anything, they were blessing us for sharing their reef and village with us and welcoming us with open arms. So she was really emphasizing here the warmth and generosity and mutual exchange that we had, these experiences that we had with these people. And before I get into the science and the coral reefs, just a few more pictures of the students in their village stays. So in the top, you can see some of the boys playing some games with their families. They went on hikes with their families. They helped care for the children in the schools and keep the children preoccupied. We went to church a few different times with the villages. Church and religion is a very big thing in their culture. And last but not least, I wanted to share this picture of the bed when one of the students arrived to her family's home for her village stay. They had this bed all made up for her very nicely, saying, "Welcome to your home." And it really just shows the generosity and the kindness of these people. So we had all of these great experiences on land, but it's time to get underwater. So our time on land was beautiful and life-changing, but we needed to get underwater to do the important science and give the villages the information they need to protect their coral reefs. So these are just some photos of the corals that we saw. I will note that these are some of the most beautiful coral reefs I have ever seen in my entire life. The coral cover and the coral biodiversity, the colors, everything about it was honestly jaw-dropping when we first arrived at some of these places. So the students really had these amazing ecosystems to study in. I wanted to show you some up close pictures of the corals. If you aren't familiar with coral biology, I can give you a little intro lesson here. Each of these are some photos that I took of the corals up close. So each of those little dots, those little in the middle here, you can see they're like brown specks, but here they kind of look like starfish. Um, each of those are called polyps, and each of the polyps on the different species of coral look differently. But each polyp is its own animal. So a coral is a colony, actually, of a bunch of different animals. Um, they are in the family of jellyfish, but they are obviously sessile. They don't move, they don't swim around like jellyfish do. But you can see that their tentacles and their mouths kind of open like jellyfish do, and they can take in food through their mouth. And they build these calcium carbonate skeletons that creates the reef structure. So it's millions and millions of polyps grow skeletons and create the structure of the reef. And what makes these corals so able to survive in these clear water is the symbiotic algae that they have living inside them. So you can see in the middle picture, the brown spots are the symbiotic algae called zooxanthellae. So this algae is what gives the coral its color, and it's also what gives the coral 95% of its food source. So if you have heard of coral bleaching, which I will talk about a little bit more in the coming slides, that is when the symbiosis between the algae and the coral breaks down and the coral loses its algae, so it loses its color and it gives it that white look. So when a coral is bleached or white, it is not dead, but it is very, very sick because it does not have the algae giving it its food source and its nutrients. Um, so that's a little intro about coral biology, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that if people are interested. So one of the first places that we stopped to do our research was Lawaki Beach House on Benga Island. This is where we met with the marine ecologist Helen Sykes. She's been living in Fiji for over 25 years, and she organizes these reef check survey programs all around the Fijian Islands. And basically, it's a monitoring technique that they can use to track the status of the coral reefs over time. So this is an example of doing the reef check surveys in an area where there is an LMMA. Milwaukee Beach House has a partnership with the local villages, and they have a very, very effective and productive taboo area. They are very good at reinforcing that there's no fishing during certain times. The goalie will open or it will close depending on the agreements. But here, this graph on the right is really showing you how productive this taboo or no fishing area has been. So, first of all, there's in here at the end of the graph in 2024, there is 45% percent more coral cover than the national average. So, while heat stress is getting worse in 2024, this is not impacting the corals in this area. That could be because of the fishing mandates, and that could also be because the corals are adapting and becoming more resilient to these changes. But the beautiful thing about this is that we are able to they are able to show this data to the village and say, look at your coral cover in 2003, it was only at 20%. And now look at it in 2024, it's at over 50% of you have over 50% coral cover. So we show them this information along with fish information that we collect, and it really reinforces and reinvigorates them to keep protecting this area. So you don't see this positive response in a lot of coral reefs around the world, but Fiji is definitely a unique place where we are seeing corals adapt and evolve. And so another really cool example of this is Fiji is they have these fluorescent corals in Fiji. They will light up during a period of heat stress to a bright neon color like pink. So you'll see here March 2003, or 2003, March 2023. This coral is bright pink. Then in May 2023, when the temperature goes down a little bit, it starts to slowly go back to its old color. And the next year, by June 2024, that coral is perfectly healthy and doing fine. So we call this fluorescence coral sunscreen. It's very, very cool biological process that the corals do, but they're able to produce these special pigments that give them the bright, glowing colors. And it's basically protecting them from bleaching. So instead of bleaching, they're fluorescing during these thermal temperature stress events. And they're blocking themselves, just like sunscreen, from UV radiation and excess light. So it keeps the zooxanthellae, the algae inside of their polyps, and can help them be more resilient to these changes. So it's not making them immune to climate change, but it is making them more resilient and giving them a chance to survive. So that's a really cool thing that the students were able to see and learn about from Helen at Milwaukee Beach House. Okay, so the students were able to learn the whole reef check methodology from Helen, and then they took this survey technique and they brought it onto the ship, and they did the same methods at the different locations on the ship. So basically, this is a reef survey technique that they were able to replicate in each area and then compare the sites to each other. And then Helen can take their data and compare it to previous sites previous surveys that she's done on the same reef. So we call this long-term monitoring, and it's essential for assessing management effectiveness. So like I showed you how productive the LMMA is or how well the corals are recovering, and this can help inform whether the management practices are working or not. So I have some videos of the students doing the reef check methodology survey. There's four different parts. The first is a belt transect to count fish and invertebrates along the transect. The second person will swim along the transect, and at each meter on the transect, they will record the substrate. So, is it a hard coral? Is it a soft coral? Is it algae? Is it sponge? A third person will swim along and record how many corals are bleached versus healthy. And then the fourth person is doing this coral recovery survey. So when we say coral recovery, we're talking about how big the corals are. Based on the size of the coral, we can determine how old it is. So the larger corals are more resilient. They've been around for longer periods of time. And the newer, smaller corals mean that these corals just came within the last 5 years. And we're trying to see the proportion of large corals to small corals to kind of see how that reef is responding over the years. So in this first video, one of the students is doing the coral recovery survey, actually two students. So they have this PVC template with these squares, and the squares are able to allow them to measure the sizes of the corals underneath. So they'll tally how many corals are smaller than the square, how many corals are two squares, how many corals are three squares, to kind of get an idea of the coral sizes on the area of that reef. And they'll do that a few different times. And then the second video is showing the transect line. So this is basically a long measuring tape, and the students line this down the reef 20 meters, and they do it four different times. And they gently swim down and tuck the transect under the coral. And the next person who's measuring the fish will start swimming down that transect line. So these were the methods that the students did. And we had them make their own research questions within these three research themes. So they could really try to understand human impacts on the coral reefs. They could try to understand coral reef management and the effectiveness of coral reef management, or they could look more at the future of coral reefs and what's important for the future. So the students have their methodology, they have their research questions, they have all of their local knowledge from the villages, and now it's time to get on the ship. So on the ship, we sampled in three different areas. We studied at Savu Savu on Vanuatu Island, and that's going to be called Point Reef in our data analysis. Then we went to Coral Island, where we call that Deer Bay. And then we went to Ono Island to the Great Astrolabe Reef. And the way that we chose these sites was based off of the Allen Coral Atlas, which is a free online site that any of you can go look at. And it will give you these colors, are showing you how much coral cover there is there, or rock cover, or algae cover. So the purple, or I'm sorry, purple, brain. The pinkish red color is coral cover. So Dr. Barr and I went on to the Allen Coral Atlas and tried to pick bay areas where the ship could fit there. And there was high coral cover, or diverse coral cover. And we chose these three sites. So again, we chose these three sites. We had our kava. We brought it on shore. We asked the village permission to collect our data at this site. And then the villages were always generous enough they wanted to hear the data, what we saw. They wanted to hear about what we collected. So they invited us back in the evenings to tell them about our data collection and what we found. So the students had great practice in science communication. They went out onto the reef and collected the data, and then they brought it on shore and explained the data to a non-scientist audience. So that was very impressive. Okay, let's get into some of the data. So remember I said along the transect, they are measuring substrate. So the different substrate sites will be hard coral, soft coral, sponge, rubble or rock, algae, different things like that. And then these are our three sites where we stopped on the ship. So you can see Point Reef has a diverse amount of substrate types, but you'll see the stony coral, which is what we're interested in. That's the reef building coral, hard coral. That's in the blue color. And Point Reef only had 19% hard coral cover. Where we went to Deer Bay and we saw 55% of that hard coral cover. And then we went to Great Astrolabe and we only saw 7% hard coral cover. So the reason I'm pointing this out to you is because all three of these reef ecosystems looked very different, and you can visualize how these reefs looked by the breakdown of what was there. So then we looked at coral species by site, and Acropora was the most abundant species across all three sites, which is amazing. Something that you might not know is actually Acropora is a threatened and endangered species in the Caribbean reefs. It's the branching coral, and it is highly susceptible to damage from storms. It's also highly susceptible to temperature stress. And unfortunately, on the Caribbean coral reefs, you don't really see many Acropora species anymore. So the fact that we're in Fiji and we're seeing all of these Acropora is great news. That is a sign of a healthy reef. Um, and the other dominant species are Pocillopora corals or Montipora corals or Porites corals. So you can see that Point Reef sort of had the greatest diversity, where Deer Bay and Great Astrolabe had mostly Acropora corals and not as much diversity. So then one of the students looked at diversity correlated with coral cover. So if there is more diversity or less diversity, is there a higher percentage of corals? And we really didn't see any correlations between coral diversity and coral cover. Another really interesting study that one of the students did was coral recovery by management type. So within the three areas that we studied, two of them were taboo no-take areas, and one of them was an open goalie with no management. So between the management being present or the management being absent, the student compared the sizes of the corals. And so you can see here where there is protection, where there is that taboo, no take area, you're seeing a higher percentage, 45% of those small corals. So that means that you have small corals. That means your coral reef is growing and your coral reef is responding well to the protection. Versus the protection being absent, you're not seeing as many small corals, but there is still a 42% of the large corals. So, there might be something working in those systems as well. Again, each system is exposed to very different local and global stressors. So understanding each site um, was really important for the student study. And you'll see in our conclusions that that's sort of what we ended up concluding was that each site really needs to be managed and differently depending on the stressors in that area. So then we get into our fish. If you're a fish person, you've probably noticed, oh, Alex hasn't talked too much about fish. I prefer to study things that don't move. I'm a coral oyster gal, but the fish studies are very, very important. So the students that were interested in fish chose to do these studies. And this is on the left, you have fish counts by site. So you can see all the sites had a lot of damselfish. And at Deer Bay, there was a lot of the Fusilier shaped fish. They also looked at butterfly fish, surgeonfish, parrotfish, all these different types, species of fish. So then what another group of students did is they took this fish data and they categorized the fish into different trophic groups. So is that fish a corallivore, which means it eats corals? Is it an herbivore? Is it a first level carnivore, a second level carnivore, etc.? And something that's really interesting here that I wanted to point out is that the herbivores are the fish that eat the algae. So corals and algae will compete for space. And if you remember the photos of the coral reefs I showed you before, you see a lot of corals, but you don't see a lot of algae. You don't really see both. You either have one or the other in an area. So an herbivore is supposed to eat the algae, which then leaves more space for the corals to grow. However, the Great Astrolabe and Point Reef had very high herbivore populations, but they had very low coral cover. So that was something interesting that we saw. So again, I'm going to show you these two videos. And what I want you to notice in the first video was one of our sites that we studied had smaller corals, but more fish. And then we went to the next site and we see these large, huge plating corals, but no fish. So you can see they're a lot smaller. Oh, sorry, the volume is on. That does not sound very nice underwater. Some people love the sound of a coral reef. They do have some beautiful sounds, but maybe not for a presentation. So there's lots of small corals and lots of colorful fish. There's fish everywhere. If you look out farther along, there's just yellow, blue, black, bigger fish, smaller fish. There's a butterfly fish, all different types of fish. And then here in the next video, you'll see some fish, but they're all like the same type of fish. So they're all these small black, there's like a one school of that smaller black fish. But there's not a lot of diversity. There's not a lot of fish there. And this was very surprising to us. It was very surprising that you would see all of this coral and not a lot of fish. So this was a sign that overfishing was playing a really big role and that maybe a taboo would work well in this area to close the goalie. So that's some of our data, but in all, here's a photo of my amazing students presenting their projects. So they had a big presentation day on their last day of the program on the ship, and they all made their posters on whiteboards, and they drew their figures or printed out their figures, and taught everyone on the ship about their research project, which was really fun because, the captain and the mates and all the crew, the engineers, they all get very, very excited to hear about what the students have been doing in the water for the past 2 weeks. And to summarize some of our research findings, Deer Bay did have the highest coral cover, but it had the lowest amount of herbivores. So again, like I said, that's very interesting and not something we expected to see. The management type did influence the size of the corals and the recovery of the corals. Overall, at all of the sites, really, there was not that much diversity, but that did not impact the coral cover on the reefs. And there were significant differences between each site. So, across all variables, every site responded differently. And so, really diving into those specific sites would be needed to understand what management practice would be good for them. So, for example, that reef that had the big corals, but it didn't have a lot of fish, maybe a management suggestion would be to have a taboo no take area. So, some general conclusions for the end of my talk is just the comparison of local management versus federal management. So, local management can be very, very effective if it's possible um, on coral reefs. So, Fiji is showing you an example of if it's possible to protect locally, it can be very, very effective. It allows for more tailored region-specific responses. So if pollution is your problem or if overfishing is your problem, you can attack that problem head on in your area and do what needs to be done to protect that reef. You're also incorporating this indigenous knowledge and this traditional knowledge that is passed on in generations from the village to protect their vanua. Whereas at the federal level, it's broader policy, there's funding, and there's maybe some more enforcement, but it's larger scale conservation efforts. It's not going to help the smaller villages feed their families. So ideally, you have a combination of both local and federal management. Um, and all in all, if you can have a combination of both, making your management place-based and making sure that your reefs are protected in a way that can, specifically in Fiji, it protects their local customs, it meets their ecological needs, and it's going to sustain their food source for their future generations, for their kids and their grandkids. So, by respecting the reefs, they're respecting their families and their culture and their heritage. So it's a really beautiful circle of life. So I just want to say Vanaka Vakalevu, which means thank you very much in Fijian. I have left my personal Gmail email and my social media handle if anybody is interested in reaching out to learn more. I would have put my school email, but I'm a little bit nervous that once I graduate, they're going to take it away. So I've been sharing my personal email with people in case you need to get a hold of me. So I'd love to take any questions or hear anybody's thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a great presentation and talked a lot about the kind of foundation of our coral reef conservation work, but specifically with that program in Fiji. There have been a number of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to start from the top. Can you share a success story of communicating scientific evidence with the community? Um, and I feel like you've already talked about it, but I don't know if you want to add anything to the research that we shared, SEA shared, and the program shared with the specific villages.
Yeah, so that I might have quickly went over it. But on Benga Island, where we stayed on Benga Island at the Lawaki Beach House, the owners of that beach house, it's a sustainable ecotourism hotel type of vibe. They have relationships with the two local villages. That's where the students did their village stay. And they also have this relationship with the marine ecologist that we worked with, Helen. So Helen has been going to the Lawaki Beach House and surveying that Vanua for years. And they've really gotten those two villages on board to have these taboo areas and to close them to fishing periodically at different times. And the coral cover in that area it has skyrocketed. And the people are seeing that. The villagers are seeing it when they're out on the reef. So they see the numbers don't mean as much to them. We show them the numbers, doesn't mean as much. But then they go out on the reef and they're like, oh, there's more fish here. There's more coral. And it really motivates them more to do it. So the Benga Island is one of the examples of a success story that the FLMMA uses. But if you Google the FLMMA, you can hear about a bunch of different other success stories across Fiji as well.
I'd also just add with those villages off that work with the Lawaki Beach House because that coral reef is doing so well. There's been a lot of tourism and then they pay those villages. And so those villages have both seen benefits economically to their villages as well, which is nice. What's the relationship with the algae during the fluorescence period?
Yeah, so a lot is still unknown, actually, as a coral biologist. We are learning more and more about this every year because as the heating gets worse, we're seeing the fluorescence more and more. Some species of algae do the fluorescence and some don't. So we have some more thermally tolerant algae, some less tolerant. But the best way I can describe it is they're changing their physiological pathways for how they do photosynthesis. So basically, they're able to shut down their photoreceptors and not have the UV light harm their uh, the way that they do photosynthesis. So the chloroplasts, where if you remember Bio 101, photosynthesis and the chloroplasts, they're able to have this protection come so that the light and the heat doesn't break down that photosynthesis, and then they're able to come back once the heat has left, if that makes sense.
Um, One member of the audience would love to hear a little bit more about your 3D printed coral and coral restoration work you did.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it was really great. Okay, so when I tell people that I put plastic corals out onto the reef, they hesitate because they're like, isn't the issue pollution and plastic? Um, so I 3D printed the corals out of a biodegradable filament called PLA. It's basically a cornstarch based filament. So over a 30-year period, that filament is actually just going to dissolve and be like a cornstarch in the water. So it has no harmful impacts on the environment. Um, I put those corals out next to living corals in different concentrations. So I had some plots that were just all 3D printed corals, and I had some plots that were all living corals. And they were coral fragments. So when you do coral restoration, you'll usually start with smaller pieces of coral and plant them out onto the reef. And that's sometimes one of the flaws of coral restoration is that you start with smaller corals, and then if, a cyclone comes or a heat stress event comes, those small corals don't really have a chance to survive. So what I found is that in my study, in my master's, I found that a 50% artificial coral and a 50% natural coral actually gives you the best combination for coral reef restoration. Because if you just put out all fake corals, you aren't getting a lot of the chemical cues and the benefits of the natural coral. But if you have all natural coral fragments, you're not really getting the structural complexity that the small fish want. The small fish want to hide in the 3D printed corals, and they want to eat, the herbivores and corallivores want to eat off of the 3D printed corals. So I found that that 50-50 combination was the most effective. So you want natural corals, real corals, but you also want to add that structural complexity to help rebuild the reef system. Oh, you're muted.
Apologies. Are the polyps on the corals the different types of animals on them?
Yes, each polyp is its own animal. Um, so, for example, some polyps might lose their algae during, they might bleach, but maybe not all of the individuals on that colony would. Oftentimes, they will all end up bleaching because it's asexual reproduction. So they're all their own animal, but they're all basically genetically the same. So, yeah.
And then Bula Bula from Rocky, congratulations on the upcoming doctorate. Do you get to come join RCS this summer?
I unfortunately do not get to join RCS this summer, but I'm very excited to keep working with SEA in the future. They're a great organization. So I hope I get an opportunity to go on RCS again.
And then thank you, everybody. I don't see any other questions, so I'm going to give one moment um, for everybody to ask any last minute questions. I did share this with somebody who asked about it, but this presentation is being recorded. We will be working to get the recording up on our website on the event page. And when we have that, if you are interested in receiving an email notifying you that we've um, uploaded these recordings, please email admissions@sea.edu. That will be the best way for us to ensure that you get notified that the recording is ready. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Alex, for being here and giving a great presentation. And good night or good afternoon to everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.